Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Firstly, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Rizki Putri. I'm from English Literature 2017, Faculty of Language and Arts, Universitas Negeri Semarang. In this video, I will present my final project presentation entitled Nostalgia in Western Travel Writing in a Year's SD Was More Postcolonial Study. The first one is Chapter 1. The first chapter is background of the study. Travel writing is a story that tells about the encounter of self and the other. As a matter of fact, travel writing is not only about the form of a document of travel description. However, other forms of documents are related to travel or cultural artifacts. According to Peter Hume, a text that is classified as a travel writing is a text that retells the depiction of a place that has been visited by the writer. A lot of travel writings often appear. Apparently, the emergence of travel writers is dominated by Western writers or travel writers who come from European countries. So, Western travel writing is a literary form that consists of information or depiction about how the East is defined by the West or how the place of Eastern people is represented by the Western travelers. That's why Western travel writing is a part of the form of colonialism, as described by O 2006, that Western travel books are stories about the adventures of Western imperialists, which have been used to inform about the cultural and racial superiority of the West over the East. One of the Western travel writers is Pico Iyer. He is not actually a Westerner, but he was born in Oxford, England in 1957, and he moved and grew up in California, United States of America. Iyer also had an American green card. Yesterday Was More is a travel writing in the form of an essay written by Pico Iyer. In his book Calling Off the Map, Some Lonely Places of the World, he tells some information about Vietnam and Iyer's experience visiting Vietnam. Besides a description of the place, there's also a picture of the colonial traces which reside in the interconnection between Western travel writers and Eastern places. This information is essential for Westerners to evaluate their identity at the current time and for Easterners to see more clearly some of the phenomena that can provoke conflicts around them. The colonial period experience is associated with race, discrimination, and identity in Eastern countries. The next chapter is reason for choosing the topic. First, the researcher uses postcolonialism theory, which is related to this topic. Postcolonialism is important for developing countries, as was to state that from the perspective of this theory, we can find out what cultural invariability is and the basis of community identity. Also, we can find traces of colonialism that still exist. Second, the researcher chooses Pico Ayer's work because he is a well-known Western travel writer who was born in England, which is part of once colonizing countries. He has written several works about his travel to the East, one of which is travel writing There Was More. So analyzing this travel writing can find out the relationship to Irish identity as a Westerner, talking about the East. Third, an essay of There Was More by Pico Iyer is important to be analyzed because it is related to the situation that has relevance to the cultural identity construction and can give some benefit to society of how they recognize this political agenda in travel writing. Next is research problems. In this final project, I formulate three research problems. First, how is post-coloniality described in the essays There Was More? The second, how is nostalgia related to post-colonial travel in the text? And the third, what are the implications of the positioning of travel object in the international community? Then, for the objectives of the study, first to identify post-coloniality in the essay Yes, There Was More. The second, to identify the relation of nostalgia to post-colonial travel in the text. And the third, to reveal the implications of the positioning of travel object in the international community. The next one, significance of the study. First, theoretically, the results of the study are expected to increase knowledge in the field of English literature, especially in the study of postcolonial literature. This research can add insight into the forms of postcoloniality in travel writing with a postcolonial approach. Second, practically, the result of the study can help readers to understand more deeply travel writing and can be helpful for future researchers as a reference in context or related to nostalgia topics. Next, moving to the chapter 2. The first one is a review of previous studies. First of all, after I explore information in the form of the results of previous studies that are relevant to this research, I found the problem that the essay entitled Seliwas Berbiko Air had not been widely studied by many researchers. However, this can also be positively viewed as this shows how the research gap of the study still exists and is thus worth doing. So to gain exposure to others' perspective on Ayer's works, a review of studies over Vico Ayer's works with different material objects were conducted. On the left side, these are studies on other Vico Ayer's works of the same genre, which is type writing, but different stories, including the first article entitled Hypen Identity, Vico Ayer's Global Soul and Transculturation, written by Raju Batakur in 2015. This study analyzed some of Vico Ayer's works, such as Sun After Dark, The Global Soul, Tropical Classical, and Viduna in Kathmandu used the concept of globality to find Ayer's identity that was described as a someone who didn't like to settle down and a product of multiculturalism. Next, the second article, entitled Cosmopolitan Travelers in a Deteriorated World, Transcultural Encounters in Pico Ayer's The Global Soul, Jet Lag, Shopping Malls, and The Search from Home 2000 by Nadia Abad. It was written in 2020. This study used a perspective approach or transcultural concept from Wolfgang Wells. This analysis found that Ayer held for nowadays view, that is globalization and deterioration, where boundaries no longer prevent humans from interacting with one another. And Ayer referred to himself as a product that fit in with matters relating to cultural translation, habitation entirety, and let deteriorated people. Then for the right side, I also review several other studies which are also about travel stories that are not written by Pico Ayer. It is done to see what research topic have been studied and what methods have been used by previous researchers. The first research entitled Gambaran Imperialisasi dan Kolonialisasi di Pulau Jawa, abad ke-19 dalam travel writing, A Visit to Java, karya William Basil Wordsworth by Nuryadi in 2017. Nuryadi analyzed travel novel entitled A Visit to Java by Western writer William Wordsworth, used Edward Said's view of East-West discourse, the definition of imperialism, and Stuart Hall representation theory. The result of this research that the West, or the Dutch, had practiced imperialism and colonization by dominating, reconstructing, and controlling the natural resources of Java Island in 19th century. The last is the dissertation research entitled Indonesia Era Reformasi dalam Sastra Perjalanan Barat, Studi Postkolonial, was written in 2018 by Rahayu Puji Haryanti. This research used several Western travel novels in the Reform era in Indonesia, that was Jive by Jeremy Allen, Journey in Java by Mary Gray, and In the Time of Madness by Richard Lord Perry. This research used postcolonial theories, such as Edward Said's view on the continuity of colonial discourse, Baba's view on the ambivalence and division of Western identity, Spivak's ideas on subalternism, and Sarah Upston's ideas on the politics of space in postcolonialism. The result of this research that 3 literary works of Western travel still showed the dominant colonial discourse through a narrative strategy that views and understands Indonesia based on the standard of the West. And the colonial discourse in 3 works of travel was the creation of Indonesia as an other, through a strategy of exoticization, stereotyping, and the use of historical sequences with several shifts to adapt self to the new era. Then the emergence of colonial discourse resulted in the recognition of Western identity as a nation that was superior to other nations, but the identity was not patent, yet ambivalent and fragile. The next subchapter is review of related literature. The first one is travel writing. Travel writing is a literary work with both fiction and non-fiction genres. Travel writers or travelers write the names of people and places and tell their experiences, similarities, and differences about a culture, narratively using literary language. Next, Western travel writing. In Western travel writing, involved as a form of narrative that reveals colonial values which represent objects related to differences or othering, written by Western writers or Westerners. So, Western travel writings forms an identity or difference that explain the other, is in different area from the self, like travelers, writers, and readers. They, the West, place their position higher on the others or the East. The next one, nostalgia in Western travel writing. The nostalgia discourse is developed by Michel Foucault by creating an imaginary space for an event at a point in the past and feeling disappointed because of the loss of that event. So, in Western travel writing, the nostalgia discourse tries to restore the lost circumstances and times, or can be called the imperial or colonial era that has been lost. There are three stages in nostalgia discourse, namely the formation of a utopia or imagination of the past, testing authenticity or testing the truth of the utopia, and the last stage is the lamentation, which is disappointment and the loss of the ideal event in the utopia. The next one is theoretical framework. In this research, I use postcolonialism theory, which is Orientalism by Edward Said. In McNair's book 2017 explained that this theory based on the perspective the West has of the East. It is about the fantasized perception of the Orient influenced by the superiority of the West over its former colonies, which is the East. In Said's book said that the Orient was almost a European invention and had been since antiquity a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories, and landscapes, and remarkable experiences. And then here's the chart of theoretical implementation of this research. Then we go to the chapter 3, which is research methodology. The first one is research design. This research used descriptive quantitative research because the results were in the form of data description. According to Parkinson and Drylin, quantitative research was the research that used methods such as participant observation or case studies that produce narratives and descriptive descriptions of a setting or practice. So in quantitative research, the researcher look for the data behind the meaning and tend to use analysis to get the findings and results. Next, object of the study. The object of this research was two types. For the material object, it used the essays There Was More in the travel book Falling Off the Map, Some Lonely Places of the World by Pico Iyer. And for formal object, it was to find out Pico Iyer's experiences, hopes, and ways to realize those expectations during his trip to Vietnam. And then type of the data. For the primary data, it will be taken from the analysis of travel ratings There Was More based on the research problems. And for the secondary data, it was taken from reference books, online articles, journals, and theories related to the research topics. After that, role of researcher. I, as a researcher, have four roles. First, as a data observer, the second as a data collector, and the third as a data analyzer, and the fourth as a data interpreter. And then, procedure of data collection. First, read the There Was More essay comprehensively and carefully. The second, took data related to the problems and topics and separated them from the known data. And the third, all identified data were listed and compiled using observation tables. And the fourth, classified the data that was appropriate and related to the research problems. And the fifth, reported data in the form of description with quotations and sentences. And the last, concluded the data that had been analyzed. Next is chapter 4, which is findings and discussion of this research. The first finding is post-coloniality in the text. Vietnam was one of the countries in Southeast Asia which was a former colony of Western countries or French in late 1880s. And there was a war between Vietnam and the United States. Therefore, the country must still have traces of colonial era and traces of war that still exist. The term of postcoloniality is traces of colonialism. The first one is colonial heritage buildings. From this quotation, Pico Iyer, as a writer from the United States, did nostalgic by finding and visiting places of the former colonial era, just as he visited old French villas and hotels, plus coconut trees and the ruins of the tamarind fruit could add the impression of the meal and still had a beautiful atmosphere that he meets in the French colonial era when it was still ruling in Vietnam. The second one is Colonial Heritage Road. From this quotation, Pico Iyer visited the Colonial Heritage Road in Hanoi, which was an Asian road called 36th Street. And Pico Iyer is nostalgic for the colonial era by seeing the atmosphere, which is still quiet and peaceful. Then Iyer imagined returning to the atmosphere, the place in the past, called the Cotton Silk Cotton Roads, by looking for and seeing old villas, stalls or shop houses from the French colonial era around there. And the third one, traces of war. From this quotation, when Pico Iyer arrived in Da Nang City, he found traces of war heritage that still exist, such as passing through the abandoned concert hall or U.S. Army semi-cylindrical barracks, past the large American airfield. Iyer also tried to pass through the airport, which played Russian rock music. Pico Iyer considered Vietnam as a place full of memories of past, in this case, the war. And the fourth one is depiction of war as a tourism attraction for the West. The tourist attraction regarding the depiction of war that Pico Iyer found when he visited Saigon. From this quotation, Pico Iyer visited the Juji Tunnel that Viet Cong soldiers used to hide and move for weeks. Pico Iyer and foreigners could imagine the events of the war past, which were very difficult and tense. The next finding is the relation of nostalgia to postcolonial travel in the text. A Western traveler tried to find the difference between West and East by imagining the past era where the representation of the self and the other still exists. According to Edward Said, the oppositional relation of the self and the other confirms the superiority of the Western identity. The journey to the past has become a strategy for finding the identity of the present travel in the postcolonial era. In the travel routines there was more. Before going to visit Vietnam, Pico Iyer had an imagination of Vietnam which referred to the colonial past at night. It can be seen from this quotation. Pico Iyer aspect in Vietnam, the couple gathered in the cafes along the waterside, sitting on the wicker chairs, their glasses balanced on stones, and watching the lights on the river while a syrupy female singer softened the night. After having utopia, Pico Iyer would visit Vietnam and then test the truth of his imagination. However, it turned out that the past utopia created in Ayer's mind before he went to Vietnam had been broken by the present situation after his arrival in Vietnam. Ayer found a new image of Vietnam. It can be seen from this quotation. Nearby, others were lined up in rows on chairs, entranced by a video advertised by hand-painted signs of an Oriental featured Meryl Streep with Oscar winner written in Vietnamese. The natural activities of Eastern society have faded and been replaced by an atmosphere that came into contact with the entrance of Western culture or showing off an advertisement starring an actress from the United States or West. So the previous utopia showed the disappointment of Pico Ayers because the image of the Vietnam past that Ayer used to explain the identity between West and East was no longer found anymore. Then Ayer tried to find places and things related to the past. It is to replace his disappointment and fulfill his imagination of the disappearance of Vietnam past utopia to create an identity boundary between the West and the East. Firstly, by visiting traditional places. From this quotation, Ayer visited the pavilion where the Emperor Tuduk had once composed poems, sipped lotus tea, and dallied with his 104 courtesans. Pico Iyer could be seen that he wanted to illustrate Vietnam, or an eastern country, was a traditional place that has imperial characteristics. Secondly, by visiting traces of war, according to this quotation, Pico Iyer passed around the former war area, which is China Beach, near Da Nang City. This place could recall the situation where Vietnam was at war against the United States or West. It turned out to put Vietnam in a marginal position as the other that related to the war itself. Thirdly, by describing the local suffering. From this quotation, Ayer wrote that his tour guide in Hue was a survivor of the Tet Offensive and lost his family. By writing about the sad incidents of war experience of local Vietnamese in his travel writing, Pico Iyer wanted to define Vietnamese or Easterner in a miserable condition. The third finding is implications of the positioning of travel objects in the international community. The impact of the depiction of Vietnam past in relation to the other will provide opinion of how the international community defines Vietnam when they read about Pico Iyer's travel writing. The first implication is Western superiority and Vietnam's inferiority. From this quotation, when Pico Iyer joined the organized tour in Saigon City, he would recall the image of the past when Vietnam was at war against the United States. Pico Iyer represented the West, or United States, which was at superior level, and Vietnam was at an inferior level, by telling the activities of the tour that showed the sad and negative things in Vietnam, such as visiting an orphanage for war victims, a drug rehabilitation center, and going to the museum, which contained photos and stories about the cruelty and domination of the West, or United States, against the East, or Vietnam. The second implication is West and East binary opposition. The first opposition is past versus present. Pico Iyer has met Vietnam as a place for him to do nostalgia, or positions Vietnam as the other because Vietnam is closely related to the past. It can be seen from this quotation. Iyer described that other cities around Saigon City were like the site 2 centuries ago, while Saigon City was like the site 2 decades ago. So here, Ayer want to assert that he came from the present or the future. The second opposition is traditional versus modern. From this quotation, Ayer wrote that we drove along the spectacular pass of clothes high above the golden beaches to Da Nang, though now it feels like an industrial city. This one-time fishing village is still graced with two extraordinary sights. It can be seen that Pico Iyer passed a certain area, then he imagined going back in time to the area that was still in the form of fishing village, traditional and isolated and untouched by many people. So Pico Iyer wanted to describe Vietnam or East as a traditional country, and he came from modern country. The third implication is the Eastern past to restore the glory of the West. According to this quotation, Pico Iyer could feel the atmosphere in the colonial era of French rule, or be like miniature French town in the Dalat City by visiting Palace Hotel, which still had antique colonial era furniture and areas, and found provincial huts which were typical houses in the province in French. With nostalgia for French or West colonialism in Vietnam or East, Westerners can restore the glory of their nation in the past during the colonial era in the East. It is because in the colonial era, the West had high position over the East, had honor and superiority. The last is chapter 5. The first one is conclusions. In Western travel writing, the traces of colonialism held image of the colonial past in the East, such as colonial heritage buildings, colonial heritage road, traces of war, and the depiction of war that is used as a tourist attraction for the West. In the post-colonial framework, Western travelers use a nostalgia strategy in the post-colonial era to confirm the identity between the West and the East, in which the East is labeled as the other. It can return back the image of the East in the picture to the image of the East in the past on the present travel. The impact of the positioning of travel object. by Western travel writers in the international community is the travel object or the place visited by the writers is positioned as the other. There is a binary position between the West and the East, such as the West is related to the present and the modern, and the East is related to the past and the traditional. Also, in Western travel writing, the East past in the colonialism era is used to restore the glory of the West as in the colonial era. The second one is suggestions. First, it will be essential for English literature students to pay more attention to travel writing because in travel writing, there are things related to forms of colonialism, such as a description of how the East is the former colonized and the West is the former colonizer in the representation of the West. This can improve critical thinking in viewing a literary work by readers or the word community. Thus, travel writing is very useful for students who will conduct a literary study using a postmodernism approach. Second, it is intended for the further researchers who want to examine more deeply the nostalgia discourse related to colonialism in other travel writing studies. That's all from my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.